If you were to go 100 feet underground, you may shiver as the temperature drops to around 58 degrees Fahrenheit. But in the cheese caves of the United States, you would find it to be much colder. 36 degrees, in fact, due to an elaborate system of pumps running a steady stream of coolants from above ground. Within the cave are thousands of red, orange, and yellow barrels lining the floor, each one weighing 680 pounds and filled to the brim with dairy products. These limestone caves in Springfield, Missouri, are home to the United States' largest stockpile of its 1.4 billion pound surplus of cheese. But the path that led to how the cheese caves came to be can be traced back to the mid-20th century. The cheesy story all started in 1949, when the Agricultural Act of 1949 gave the Commodity Credit Corporation, a government-owned corporation dedicated to stabilizing farm incomes, the authority to purchase dairy products like cheese from farmers. The CCC had been around since the Great Depression, when it was created as part of the New Deal's attempt to stabilize prices and help farmers. During the 1970s, as Americans sat in long gas lines and watched the economy drop, they faced another crisis, an unprecedented shortage of dairy products. In 1973, dairy prices shot up 30% as the price of other foods also inflated. When the government tried to intervene, prices fell so low that the dairy industry begged the government to change their ways. So in 1977, under President Jimmy Carter, the government poured money into the dairy industry, motivating production and alleviating the crisis, putting $2 billion into the dairy industry in just 4 years. Suddenly, dairy farmers who had been hurting were flush with cash and producing as much milk as they could in order to take advantage of the government's support. The government purchased the milk dairy farmers couldn't sell and began to process it into cheese, butter, and dehydrated milk powder. As dairy farmers produced more and more milk, stockpiles ballooned. Eventually, the stockpile hit over 500 million pounds, stored in hundreds of warehouses across 35 states. The huge supply was a problem, but there was another catch. The government had no idea what to do with all that cheese. Probably the cheapest and most practical thing to do would be to dump it into the ocean, a USDA official told the Washington Post in 1981. There was also a confusion as to how long the processed American cheese, designed to be stored for long periods of time, really lasted. As officials scrambled behind the scenes to figure out how to deal with the cheese, the conundrum became public when the Agricultural Secretary John R. Block showed up at a White House event with a 5-pound block of greening, moldy cheese and showed it to the press. "We've got 60 million of these that the government owns," he said. "It's moldy, it's deteriorating, we can't find a market for it, we can't sell it, and we're looking to try and give some of it away." As the public got wind of the existence of all that surplus cheese, it began to sharply criticize then-President Ronald Reagan. He had been elected in part by pledging to reduce the federal food stamp program. But there were hungry Americans still suffering from the after effects of the recession. Why not give them the cheese? In December of 1981, Reagan relented. At a time when American families are under increasing financial pressure, their government cannot sit by and watch millions of pounds of food turn to waste, he said in a public address. As a result, he said he'd free 30 million pounds of cheese from the country's stockpile. He created the Temporary Emergency Food Assistance Program, which began handing out the blocks of processed cheese to the elderly and low-income communities and the organizations that serve them. It was given away for free by pickup to people at food banks, community centers, and so on. Now known as government cheese, the pungent-smelling cheese, which tasted somewhere between Velveeta and American cheese, was ultimately distributed to the tune of 300 million pounds. The cheese became associated with hard times. While some were grateful, others hated the ways in which the cheese advertised their low socioeconomic status. Today, some people actually recall the cheese fondly. Food writer Tracy Lynn Lloyd recalls how its weird texture made it good pretty much only for mac and cheese or grilled cheese sandwiches. If someone made me a grilled cheese today with government cheese, I probably couldn't eat the whole thing. It would be far too salty for my current taste. But I'd still take one bite, just for the memories. The United States government finally got out of the cheese storing business in the 1990s, when dairy prices started to calm down. Flash forward to 2019, when the US again found itself storing cheese, this time to the tune of 1.4 billion pounds. Yet it was not the government storing it. It is almost entirely owned by private companies now. Amid trade disputes and declining dairy consumption nationally, the American government has been subsidizing dairy products, with companies stockpiling America's surplus cheese. So deep under Springfield, Missouri, the industrial-sized cheese cave, 2 million square feet in size, has been allocated for storing cheese. 400,000 square feet of which Velveeta rents to store its supply of pasteurized processed cheeses and cream cheese. The cheese caves are designed to be a consistent, cool environment, built underground to provide natural insulation. They also contain high humidity, anywhere from 75 to 99% relative humidity based on the temperature in the space. Without the proper amount of moisture in the air, the moisture in the unripe cheese would evaporate out, cracking and hardening the cheese and basically turning it into an inedible milk rock. But according to the USDA, American milk consumption has dropped from 275 pounds per capita in 1975 to 149 pounds per capita in 2017. Though demand is declining, production is not. It has risen 13% since 2010. In 2016, the American dairy industry dumped a whopping 43 million gallons of milk into fields. Though this waste is staggering, it is also not representative of the size of the surpluses being run by dairy farms. The dairy industry received $43 billion in 2016 and $36.3 billion in 2017 from the federal government. In 2018, 42% of revenue for U.S. dairy producers came from some kind of government support. It is important to note that the dairy lobby is largely responsible for influencing politics to dedicate this money for the industry, and the money mostly goes to big dairy companies that fund the lobby, leaving smaller operations to fend for themselves in the increasingly competitive market. Also, although the number 1.4 billion pounds sounds like a lot, and it is, let's take a moment to put it into perspective. According to USDA statistics, the average American eats 34.1 pounds of cheese every year and is projected to eat 36.5 pounds by 2024. That means that the US consumes around 12 billion pounds of cheese per year. Yet, since dairy farmers already produce more than we consume, we don't have any way of getting rid of the stored supply. Because we are still outpacing supply with demand, the Clinton administration started Dairy Management Incorporated in the 1990s to help move dairy products that were less and less in demand. With an annual budget of $140 million, this offshoot of the Department of Agriculture works to get Americans to consume more dairy, even though the Department of Health and Human Services has conducted studies showing that dairy might not be as healthy to consume regularly as once thought, and 36% of Americans are lactose intolerant. Dairy Management Incorporated, nonetheless, launches campaigns like the infamous Got Milk ads, Taco Bell Cheesy Crust, Taco Bell Double Steak Quesadillas, and milk as part of a federal school lunch program. They even bailed Domino's out after the 2010 recession as part of an attempt to keep Americans eating cheese. Dairy Management's main strategy has been to increase consumer confidence in milk and dairy products by expounding the health benefits and nutritional value. These efforts aimed at increasing consumer consumption have been successful. Despite the decrease in milk consumption among Americans, the average American consumes 14 more pounds of cheese a year than they did in 1990. Prisons have contracts with national and state dairy producers, schools opt into government programs that subsidize and push dairy products, and charitable organizations still receive cheese donations from the U.S. government, albeit less than they did in the 80s. Schools play a large part in propping up the milk industry as well. School milk accounts for about 7% of all fluid milk sales in the United States. This is due in part to the fact that the National School Lunch Program requires fluid milk be offered daily alongside free meals. The Special Milk Program further promotes dairy-heavy school meals, reimbursing all participating schools for their fluid milk purchases in full in an effort to lower milk prices. Even without the government endorsement, dairy has no problem finding its way into schools. Students who are behind on lunch payments are sometimes offered cheese sandwiches as a replacement for a conventional lunch. The cheese caves are a difficult problem to solve, one that is persisting into its 5th decade. It seems unlikely that we will be able to export the cheese beyond American borders, as approximately 70% of the world as a whole is lactose intolerant, and those that do consume cheese, mainly European nations, tend to dislike the American variety in favor of their own products. And nobody, with the exception of the guy that wanted to throw it into the ocean, wants to see all that good food go to waste. It seems as though the dairy industry is locked in a stalemate. Dairy farmers don't want to produce less. Americans can only eat so much more, and there is only so much space underground to keep storing cheese. Thank you for watching Learn Something New. What do you think should happen with all the cheese stored underground? Also, if you liked the video, please consider liking and subscribing. See you next time!